Well, good evening, everybody. I'm gonna go back to the starting splash here for a second. I'm gonna come right back while users log in. Okay, so I'll be right back. All right, back again. So we'll wait for a few more users to log in, and we'll get started on this webinar on structure scan, side and down imaging, and we'll have a Q&A section at the end, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that anyone has. So I'm just going to see how many users we have logged in now. If you can't hear me or anything, please drop a note right there in the chat section if there's any issues. All right. Well, it's about an hour webinar, so I want to jump right into it. Again, my name's Dale Wyman. I'm a Navico Pro Staff team member located here in Massachusetts. And because of the ongoing pandemic, we can't get out to the stores, the retailers, and meet with our customers in person. So we're all doing our part to try to stay in touch this way. All right. So I'm going to jump right over into the webinar and we're going to get going. Again, the topic is on side and down imaging and a little bit of discussion on 2D because I feel that it's a technology that we're all going to still rely on for quite some time. All right, so hopefully you can see the screen here. And I'm just going to go through it in this mode and discuss the various topics. And then we'll get into some actual interpretation. So we're going to cover specifically structure scan, what it is, what you're looking at, because that's the most common question that I get, or concern is that it works for them, individual users, but they're not always sure what they're seeing when they're utilizing it. So first of all, for structure scan and side imaging, down imaging, you have to have a transducer, all right, and a unit that supports it. So you have to have some sort of a structure scan transducer, structure scan HD, total scan, structure scan 3D, or an active imaging transducer such as the newest active imaging 3-in-1. Structure scan itself is a high frequency technology that provides high detail images, and the two primary frequencies that we're going to discuss tonight and that we utilize in our products are 800 kilohertz and 455 kilohertz. The two modes we're going to talk about are side imaging and down imaging, often referred to as SI and DI. And I don't use it very much, but we can also overlay down imaging on traditional 2D sonar. But with the latest technology, especially with fish reveal incorporated into down imaging, that's no longer the necessity that it once was. All right, so within the identification of targets that we see using side and down imaging, we're going to talk about dark versus bright objects. We're going to pay particular attention to sonar shadows. We're going to look at what weeds look like in side imaging, some examples of wood, rocks, and fish beds, man-made objects, docks, and so forth. They don't always look like what most people would expect. And of course, fish. And in some cases, I don't have any slides of it here tonight, but I've done some videos on my Facebook page and my YouTube channel where we could actually see the thermocline and in some cases algae blooms. So all of these things, right, are subjects of interest when you're using structure scan, specifically, side imaging and down imaging when we're in the process of looking for fish holding cover and fish. All right. Structure scan settings on your unit. We'll talk about the basic settings first. And range determines the visible water depth and side scan range. What I typically do for a side scan range, I've talked about this in previous seminars and so forth. I typically choose either 2 to 3 times my water depth for my side scan range. So, for example, if I'm fishing in 20 feet of water, I will set my range to 2 or 3 times that, typically 3 times, out to about 60 feet. And we'll talk more about why. Frequency settings, I briefly mentioned already. 800 kilohertz versus 455 kilohertz. 455 kilohertz, the lower frequency, uh, puts more power into the water through your transducer. It's for greater depths and ranges, and at times you'll see brighter returns if you choose to that frequency. But we'll talk specifically as we go on through the webinar when you would want to use one over the other. Contrast controls the level of dark to bright ratio in your sonar returns. I adjust mine based on light levels that I'm fishing in. So it's an adjustment that, as fishermen, when you're out there using your graphs, that you'll want to change based on the lighting conditions that you're fishing in. It's the same as sensitivity in 2D mode. So you'll notice that you don't have the sensitivity, but you do have the contrast setting under your menu items. So think of it as sensitivity because essentially that's what it is. Views. Again, the view options are down, left only, right only, or left and right. On the new HDS Lives and the Elite TI2 units, what Navico Lowrance has done is, instead of making you navigate through the menu items to select each of those views right on the main page, when you press your pages button, you'll see the individual down imaging and side imaging selections right there. So it makes it much easier. You no longer have to, navigate for particular views from one menu. So it makes it a lot easier, as most of you know who are already using Elite TI2s or the HDS Live units. Palettes, primarily, if I can get it out, use the palettes that you'll see in the slides as I go along. But again, the palettes are personal preference. And all I can say in addition to that is, again, that's typically based on lighting conditions as well, and how your eyes react to the particular sonar returns that you see. Okay, some of the advanced settings that you'll see when you drop into side or down imaging are surface clarity. And surface clarity reduces noise from various things induced by the boat or wave action. You're out there on a windy day and you got waves and so forth going. You will have surface clarity or surface clutter, I should say, in your display, so you can cut back on that by adjusting this particular menu item. And the default is low, and that's typically how I leave mine unless there's a need to change it. Noise rejection reduces noise caused by the various pumps that we have on our boats. Those could be bilge pumps, live well pumps, anything that causes electromagnetic interference. You can reduce some of that utilizing noise rejection. The default is on, and again, I leave mine at the default to get the clearest images. Flip left and right, basically it depends on whether or not you mount your transducer with a factory bracket or an aftermarket bracket. Real quick, with the factory bracket, the cable coming out of the nose of the transducer will be pointing forward or towards the bow of the boat when you mount it. So obviously, if you think about that, the right hand side is going to be the right and the left hand side is going to be the left. However, if you use a non-factory bracket, in some cases, that cable coming out of the front of the transducer will point aft or towards the rear of your boat. And when you do that, the right is no longer the right and the left's no longer the left. So in the advanced settings, there's this flip left right menu item. And again, if your transducer cable's on a non-factory bracket and the cable comes out of the back and points aft of the boat, you should go in, or you have to go in and change this and turn it on so that you're looking at sonar returns that are truly on the right and truly on the left. Range lines are pretty self-explanatory, and it's a user preference. Again, I leave mine off. I typically want my screen, my display, as clear as possible to focus on what I'm seeing when I'm using side and down imaging, and specifically looking for fish themselves. Having the range lines on gives you a better idea of, the range, both, in the vertical water column or horizontally, but that information is, on your display, both on the side and along the bottom anyway. So as you become more experienced, you get pretty good at making very good educated guesses onto how far away that sonar return is. Preview, some of you have probably used it and you've seen it up at the top of your multifunction display or the display when you're out fishing. And it's a preview bar where you can scroll back in time and review history, right, of what you've passed over, and review it while you're on the water. And you can even go back, and touch a specific area on there and drop a waypoint if need be. Recording structure scan data can also be recorded and saved. I think I've done some videos on that up on my YouTube channel, but basically you can record a lot of the information that you're seeing by using one of the micro SD slots, or if you only have one, using the micro SD slot to record the data. New live mapping is something that I'll cover, or maybe Lowrance will cover with the new live webinars that they've been doing on a regular basis. But with our newest units and CMAP, which used to be Insight Genesis, and I've used that for a long time, you can now take and record your own maps in greater detail than perhaps what comes standard with the chip. All right. All right, this slide is really important as we go forward. I like to talk about the frequencies, and I like to drive this point home because this slide, what it's showing you is it's giving you all the frequencies that you could use for both 2D, down imaging, and side imaging on our units. It also gives you the cone angle, not in the degrees. You don't really have to worry about that and memorize that. But what you do have to memorize and consciously think about when you're out fishing is when you change your frequency, what happens to that cone angle and that coverage area. So I'll start right here in the middle, this pink area. And if you're using, your traditional 2D sonar and you're using 200 kilohertz, you can see that the cone angle at the higher of the 2D frequencies is smaller. And once that signal hits the bottom, the coverage area is also smaller. Looking at 2D, switching to 83 kilohertz, your cone angle increases, and so does your coverage area along the bottom. So the way I explain that is your frequency when it comes to cone angle and coverage area is inversely proportional. So the higher the frequency, the smaller the cone, the smaller the coverage area. You might ask, well, why would you do that? 200 kilohertz, the higher frequency, all right, gives you much better detail in your sonar returns, right? Much better definition. So 83 kilohertz, I think I've already said that, again, being inversely proportional, the lower the frequency, the greater the cone angle and the greater the coverage area. Right, and that's true as well in down imaging, as you can see here. If we focus on the light blue, down imaging, while we select 455 kilohertz, gives you this larger cone angle, and it also gives you a larger coverage area than the other frequency being 800 kilohertz. So you have to consciously make a decision when you're out there. Do you want to see more area? Do you want to put more power into the water? Or do you want greater definition in your sonar returns? To give you an example, in both down imaging and 2D, let's say that you were on 200 kilohertz on 2D and you had a fish over here outside of that coverage area, that cone angle, and you knew that they were down there because you were catching them, let's say, but you're not seeing them on your graph. Well, that fish over here, right, is outside that coverage area, outside that cone angle. So if you're on 200 kilohertz, that fish is never going to pass into that cone, right, leaving a sonar return. But if you were to switch to 83 kilohertz and that fish was right here, larger coverage area, you would get a sonar return, right, an image displayed of that target, that fish, just by simply switching to a lower frequency and thus a larger coverage area. All right. Same thing is true on down imaging. You could have a fish sitting right over here, all right, and be on 800 kilohertz and you're not going to see it. But if you were to change to 455 kilohertz, giving you that wider cone angle, that wider coverage area, you would. And we'll talk more about what those targets look like, both in 2D, which most of you are probably already familiar with, and you may also be familiar. I don't know why these pop-ups keep coming up. Anyhow, you may be familiar as well, and most of you probably are, that what fish returns look like in down imaging and side imaging. On the same subject, looking up at side imaging, the same principles I just talked about are true. All right, so with side imaging, 800 kilohertz, right here, this green section is the coverage area looking out down and to the sides of your boat. All right, that's how the cone angle or the sonar signal is transmitted from the transducer, both down and outward. And you can see again, the higher the frequency, the smaller that coverage area is going to be. But again, you get greater definition with the higher frequency. Switching to 455 kilohertz inside imaging, you basically get this whole 180-degree coverage area, all right, both to the right and to the left, 90 degrees this way, 90 degrees this way, when you utilize that higher frequency. All right. So keep those points in mind as we go along, and particularly while you're on the water. So from here on, with those basic understandings, we're going to start to take a look at what you are seeing when you're out on the water. Because again, I hear this all the time that, I'm not quite sure what I'm looking at. So real basic, all right, again, with side imaging, as we're looking at right here, this is where your transducer would be, top center of this slide. And all the information at the top is current. It's what you are currently seeing as you're moving along, or if you're stationary. And it's best for side imaging to be moving at anywhere from 2 to 10 miles per hour. All right. And the information flows down like a waterfall. So anything down here below the top is all history. But what this slide is trying to show you when it comes to interpreting what you can visibly see on the surface is, here we have an area where there's lush weeds, all right? There's heavy lily pads with those heavy stems that you've all seen. And in side imaging, lush weeds like that will give you this kind of heavy cotton ball effect when you're looking at side imaging. The darker areas, all right, is where there's voids in the weeds, like right here. We'll talk more about that. That's a little cut within that weeds. And then there's some more over to the right, but they're not quite as heavy as you can see, and not tightly clustered as here. All right, so that's an image that shows you clearly what you will or what you should expect to see when you have weeds such as those. The next slide is, again, an image of what you'll see for weeds. But if you notice here in the underwater camera shot, that these are a different kind of weed, all right? Thinner stem, still have some broad leaves, but in your side imaging, all right, it's not going to be as thick as it was in the previous slide. You'll have these varying, white returns, which are the stems of that plant, but they're not as closely clumped together, right? Still an indication of a lot of weeds in that area, and also where those weeds start and they go all the way to the shoreline here, all right, and different bottom composition, which we'll talk about as we go through the slides. All right, so again, another shot of weeds, and this is showing you that tall weeds that have grown will yield sonar shadows. And it's pretty easy to understand if you think about a flashlight. All right, if you were to shine a flashlight out onto, a tall, hedges that are in your yard or something, a whole row of them, that light's going to hit those, and it's going to, if it goes through at all, it's going to project a shadow on the other side. That same thing's true with your sonar signal. When that sonar signal comes down and then goes outward, all right, it's going to strike these taller weeds. And if you think about that flashlight example again, that signal is going to strike those taller weeds, and then past that, it's going to cast a shadow, all right, or there's going to be a shadow where the sonar signal cannot get a reflection off of it. It's all that energy is being reflected off these taller weeds right here. Okay, so that's very important as we progress too. And we're going to talk a lot about sonar shadows because they can give you just as much information as these brighter returns. So you want to pay attention to both of those when you're out on the water. All right. Another example, transition areas is something as fishermen we're always looking for. And this is showing a perfect example of that, where the weeds on the right, again, your transducers here, this is all current information at the top right and the top left. But you can see on the right-hand side of your boat, if you're traveling in this direction, all right, that all these heavy weeds right here go all the way back to the shoreline over here on the right. However, on the left-hand side, all right, you can see right here, right along the edge, this picture of the fish partially covers it there in the center, but you can see a very well-defined weed line edge right here. And that's what it'll look like on your side imaging sonar. And we all know as fishermen that those fish, all right, like to hang out right on those weed line edges. So that's something that you always want to pay particular attention to. And it doesn't mean you're always going to see, fish on that weed line edge, as we know, but this is all tools that are, there within your multifunction display for you to not only locate fish, but fish holding cover. Sometimes they can be tucked right inside those weeds. And, if you're flipping or pitching or, running another type of bait right along them, right along the weeds, that those fish will pop right out at times and grab it. The next slide is one that I took that I like to use to graphically show several things. And again, I have some older images, all right, that I took when I was running carbons, and I utilized a structure scan transducer. And then I have newer ones. So I did that in this webinar so that you can contrast both, some of the older transducers, which did a wonderful job. In particular, the Structure Scan 3D transducer with that Structure Scan 3D module that did the processing produced some wonderful images, and a lot of people still use it. I just helped work on a customer's boat that's brand new from the factory, and that's what it came rigged with. So again, what are we looking at here? Again, all the information at the top is current. Everything below us is history. What I wanted to point out is, first off here, as I said, the harder the object is that sonar signal hits, it returns a stronger signal. With side imaging, the stronger or harder the object, I should say, the stronger that sonar return is going to be, and it gives off a brighter return, just like you saw in the previous slides with the weeds. Well, rocks give off very strong returns, and if you notice, right, on the left-hand side of that rock, there's a rather large shadow. Again, the sonar energy comes down from the transducer and then outward in this direction, strikes this rock, is reflected back up through your transducer to your head end unit where it's processed and that image is displayed. But when you start looking at objects that are right here on the bottom, pay attention to those sonar shadows, because not only does this image tell you that that rock is bigger than a lot of the other ones, the shadow tells you a lot about it too, right, in relation to its physical size. All right. So over here on the right hand side, you can see that this whole section right here is much brighter. So it's whatever that bottom composition is, whether it's finer gravel or whatever it happens to be, it's sending back a much brighter signal. And the other reason that this side is in a lot of cases darker is because that's where your deeper water, we could be right along a drop off here, and that'll yield a darker return on that side as well. We have some more shadows up here, and again, a lot of times based on your contrast setting, you can see I have mine pretty high. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but you can see this shadow right here almost looks like the shadow of a fish. And oftentimes when your bottom is real hard, yielding a bright return, and your fish yield bright returns, you'll see a better image in the shadow than of the fish itself. But when I zoomed in on this, when I was out on the water using my zoom buttons or using the zoom feature right here, all right, I could tell that that was not a fish, it was a stump. All right, so what do fish look like inside imaging? Again, a lot of you know, but fish, all right, inside imaging are returned and displayed inside imaging as these dots right here. And we can clearly see there's two fish, one, two, and that they're suspended. And again, without those range grid lines, I can see that they're right around 20 to 22 feet deep. And this right here is probably another fish very close to the bottom. What else are we seeing in this slide? We were seeing that we were running in about 20 feet of water, and then is that water column, which is all this black area, all right? All this black area is your actual water column. Sonar signal comes down and out, just like you saw on the display, and then side imaging also shoots to the right and left, that sonar signal. So all this information here is right on the bottom, whereas everything in the dark area is in the water column. So clearly there's two fish right there. All right. Some of the things I talked about earlier, I'm in 20 feet of water. I typically have my range set to twice that to provide very good images. The further out you go with your range, all right, I'll guarantee you, you'll probably get less detail. So you really want to pay attention to your range. Contrast with this green bar, I can tell on this unit, the same is true with the HDS Lives. I know I have contrast set to auto, but you can still adjust it, which is this auto +7, right? So I actually have the contrast set very high right now. And again, that's to give me a better image between harder, lighter, and darker objects. The palette is something, again, that's personal preference. I happen to like this particular palette, both when I ran the Structure Scan 3D module, and again, a very similar pattern with the with the HDS Live unit. Right here, you can see the view is both left and right, and very importantly, right here is the source. I've had a lot of questions with people even out on the water saying, Dale, all I'm getting, is a straight line down through the middle or a completely black screen on my display. And I tell them, well, make sure you check your source. Your source has to be the unit. In this case, it was the Structure Scan 3D module that my transducers were connected to. If you change the source to something where your Structure Scan transducer is not connected to, well, it's somewhat obvious that you're not going to get, valid returns. You have to make sure you have it sourced correctly. All right. So the slide points is everything that I just talked about. So in the, I'll go through them again real quick, but I'm trying to save time so that you're not all here for an hour and a half. I know after an hour people start to fade out, but first and foremost on that slide was the fish we were looking for and how they're displayed as dots in side imaging. I talked about shadows, and it gives you information on the size not only of boulders but of as fish as well. We looked at that depression, the change in the bottom depth, and you notice that it was right when we went over that change in the bottom depth that those fish appeared. So they were suspended right over that little dip in the bottom. All right, bright versus dark returns. I've explained the brighter the object, the harder it is, the stronger the sonar returned signal is. Whereas if it's darker, could be a muddier bottom, it could be an old rotted tree stump, something like that will not yield as strong a return, and it will not yield as bright a return. Talked a little bit about contrast settings real quick. Again, even though it's in auto, you still have the ability to adjust the level of it. And that's something that you should do, particularly on days, we all have them that it's slow, get out there. And the best way I tell everyone to learn your unit is to fool around with it when you're out on the water and, the fishing's not that great. Now, this slide in particular, I love to show because it clearly shows where I have my customized page with my chart up on the top, my 2D sonar in the upper right, and my side imaging on the bottom. Those of you who may be new to side imaging have relied a lot in the past, as we all have, on traditional 2D sonar. And with 2D sonar over here on the right, this is where your transducer is. This is all current information, and everything to the left is history. All right, so we'll talk about that on this slide a little bit, but taking a look at this, you can see right here with 2D, this particular palette, again, the brighter or harder the bottom return, the brighter the return is going to be on. The harder the bottom, I'm sorry, the brighter the return is going to be. And with this palette, a harder bottom yields this yellow, all right, color, and a softer bottom gives you this reddish blue. You can see right here I have a fish, the traditional, it's not a perfect arch, but there's reasons for that. There's another one over here, and then there's some fish right above that hump, but they're not directly above it. I can tell based on the side imaging view that they're not directly above it, that they're probably off to the side of it. So the point in this slide is as you're going along, right, and all of a sudden we're here, we get here, we see this sharp rise, we see this leveling out, and then we see this sharp drop. Typically in nature, right, you're not going to run across objects like that, but being without side imaging and relying only on 2D, you might say to yourself, well, that's just a big rock, or that's a fairly large stump that I just went over. So there's a lot of guesswork, right, involved in interpreting 2D images. But you can clearly see down in side imaging that it's not, right, a stump or it's not a rock at all, that it's literally the top of the roadbed. So clearly here is an old roadbed. This is in Quabbin Reservoir. And oftentimes those bass, those smallmouth will hang right around these roadbeds. So we seek them out a lot. And when we find them, all right, we drop a waypoint, which I did right there. All right. So again, the dark area is all the water column. All right. And comparing the images, this right here is history on 2D. This is history on side imaging, and you can see that it's a darker blue. It's not as bright, so it's a softer return, just like you see here in 2D. And then the closer and closer we get to this roadbed, the stronger the signal is. And then when we're right over the top of it, it's very strong. There's almost no orange or blue. It's a very strong return here because we're going right over the top of that roadbed. All right. I hope that helps you make or draws a good comparison, is what I'm trying to get at, between what you had to rely on when you only had 2D and now how side imaging with its higher definition clarifies all that for you. There's much less guesswork. So in the same area, this next slide, All right. Some of you that know me know that I recently retired from MassDOT, Massachusetts Department of Transportation, and had a lot of friends there. And what I did is I gathered up a lot of very old maps that they had of Quabbin before it was flooded, and I looked at all the where all the old roads were, and I looked at even where there were some old bridges. And if you talk to people that know the history of Quabbin, most of the standing structures were all knocked down. Land was burned to clear way for the reservoir and everything. But I made it a point to go out and locate at least any remaining structure from where these bridges used to be. And that's exactly what I came across here. So with another customized page, you can see that I had it split for down imaging, which is right here on the top, and again, side imaging on the bottom. When I look at people's screenshots that they post online, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, of course, I'm always looking for, the objects that they're trying to show, but I pay particular attention to their frequency settings and any other menu item that they're showing over here, because it helps me, and now it should help you determine, when you should use 800 kilohertz versus 455. You can see, actually, I cut it off a little bit up here, but I was only in about 30 feet of water right here. So I've got my range set to not quite twice that, but I was really trying to get as much detail as I could on this structure. So what you're looking at here is a relatively flat bottom, and then right here, you're seeing part of the Swift River channel. All right, so this is an old river channel right here, and this center piece that you're looking at right here, very strong return, is an old column of a bridge. It's the center column. These red lines with down imaging, we have a feature called fish reveal, where instead of a fish like this one shown right here, just being that white dot, right, it's brought back the traditional arch of 2D, so it makes for easier identification of fish. And these are fish suspended up over that bridge about 20 feet. You can see right here the range that I was talking about is still shown there. But I started looking at this and I said, well, that's not one big long fish. And then after, looking at older pictures and stuff that I had and just knowing a little bit about bridge construction, right, I'm guessing that that's an old steel cable that went right across to help support whatever material was the top of that bridge. One of these days, I'm going to go back out there with my underwater camera and I'm going to take a picture and verify that that's exactly what it is. Down below is just a different view, right? It's looking out to the side. I went right over the top of it. So with side imaging, when you go directly over the top of something, all right, it's going to be shown just like this, with part of that on one side and part of that structure on the other. So again, you can clearly see the old river channel, top of that roadbed, river channel, same thing over here, and then that center column right there. All right, with side imaging, I didn't see that cable, which is why I want to go back and make sure that, there is something there. All right, and again, my palette for side imaging was different than what I had selected for my down imaging display. All right, and again, frequency right there and my frequency right there. I was on auto contrast, which just happened to work out perfect for that day. You can see my images were near perfect. Next slide, again, is a comparison, right, of a 2D image and of a limited side imaging display. And I purposely put this in here to try to give you folks an idea of how you set up your custom pages may or may not limit what you see. And in this case, it limits it quite a bit. So if we focus on this 2D side again, you can see I had a relatively flat bottom, and then there's this very deep depression in the bottom right here. Also shown over here on side imaging very clearly with all this heavy rock and stuff all around it that you don't really see all that detail over here in 2D. But look at, the nice solid fish returns that are directly above that in the 2D image. So I actually have one, two, and then a third one here. And don't always think that because your sonar returns this fish, this third one being blue, that it's not just as big as these other two. Remember that cone angle, okay? If that fish is just on the outside of that cone angle, it's in the is not going to be as strong. Therefore, the image is not going to be as bright. So that fish that's blue there was probably right on the outside of that cone. And then notice here I have two more fish clearly right directly above this hump. Jumping over to the side imaging view, right? If you look right at that hump, this hump right here is this one, right? These fish right here show up very, very clear as dots on my side imaging. And again, if you struggle to see them out on the water, you can always zoom in on them with your zoom button. But when I presented this before in a previous seminar, people said, well, where are those two suckers? All right, those are two, three of them. Where are those over here in side imaging? If you think about it for a minute, remember when I said in the previous slide, if you go directly over something, it'll be shown both on the right and the left. Well, with a large object, go back to this slide like this, it clearly will, but with a smaller fish, all right, you may catch it, but the reason we're not seeing these two right here is because I limited my view to right only, and these two fish, if I had both left and right, like I do here, all right, I would see that those two fish were more to the left of my boat, and in side imaging, they'd probably be located right about here. All right, so the point of the slide is to, again, show you the contrast between traditional 2D sonar. You can still get excellent returns, and it's still an excellent tool that I'll never do away with for locating both structure and fish. But with side imaging, try to customize your screens, all right, or your pages, I should say, that don't limit your view. All right, these two fish clearly visible right here, but these two larger, all right, or stronger returns, people scratch their head and say, well, where are they? So I purposely put this in here, and I mention it in the slide points here. All right, I'll leave that up there for a second, but everything that, it talks about. And again, folks, all this will be recorded and stored up on my YouTube channel, so you can always come back to it and watch it again. All right, but this just explains everything that I just explained. All right, next slide is another one that I took while I was fishing out on Quabbin Reservoir, and again, that I've used in previous webinars. I customized my page here so that I could show you that the direction of travel that my boat was taking, which is right here shown by my red trail. The yellow arrow is pointing at one of the big baffle dam at Quabbin Reservoir. And if you've ever seen it, or if you've seen other baffle dams or causeways and stuff on other bodies of water, you often see a lot of riprap along those causeways or those baffle dams. The 2D image over here we'll come back to in a second, but what I wanted to show you is all that riprap that I was just talking about that you can physically see with your own eyes when you're out there, how far out into the water it comes. All right, so my boat is here again, my transducer's here, all current information. Well, this is all that riprap, real strong, bright return, and you can see that the minute right where it starts. All right, so again, there's that transition area right here, and you can see that that riprap goes all the way right to the edge of that baffle dam, as you would expect. Right, that's how it was constructed. So you can clearly see that. Now, remember I talked about the shadows when you're using side imaging. It's not always bright objects we're looking for, but those shadows are important. You see this shadow right here? You see the white object that is basically the same shape? That's more than likely, I have about 90% certainty that that's a large fish right there. And it gives a bright return, and it's a little bit up off the bottom because you see a sonar shadow right below it. The higher the fish is in the water column, the greater the distance that shadow will be from that particular fish. All right, and we'll see that later when I show you some examples of trees, and it drives the point home even more. But I get excited when I see something like that because I can put a waypoint right in this area and then just cast out to that fish. And I know that it's relatively close to the bottom. So that's going to help me determine what I'm going to throw at that fish. Okay. Jumping over to the other side, you can see where we came up out of deeper water. Again, this is all the water column. So the wider this is, the deeper the water. I came up out of deeper water and then it got a little bit shallower. You can see the same thing here with the 2D sonar. I was in deeper water here, and the reason you don't see it is because I had my range set manually. It wasn't on auto, but I come right up like it shows here in side imaging. Okay. On the other side, you can see that the bottom for quite a ways out, all right, say, well, this is like 20, that's like 30 feet away from me right there. And over here, it goes way out to 80. So there's quite a bit of hard bottom off to my right as well. And then you can distinctly see right along here, all right, that there is a ledge. Right, see where it drops right off. This darker area, if you think of the sonar signal again, goes out, it strikes this area very strong, signal gets returned, so it's real bright. But that sonar signal can't go straight out and then, just miraculously go down again. So it creates that shadow behind it. Um, but over here, I also see like there's a dot right there. It could be some fish that are also, there's a few of them. They could be suspended right up over that deeper water. There's some shadows down here as well. And if you zoom in on them, it'll help you determine. Here's an example right here, this particular shadow, all right? If there was a fish there, all right, because I have the contrast up pretty high, it might wash out that stronger white return that you see over here. But again, pay attention to those shadows because a lot of times those shadows are your indication of fish and not necessarily the white object as you see there. Hope that makes sense. Slide points again. I just went over everything, so I won't, tie up a lot of our time uh, repeating them. All right. Next slide is again a contrast of 2D, and now I'm contrasting with down imaging. So down imaging again is a high definition. All right, sonar technology utilizes higher frequencies than traditional 2D sonar does, and therefore you get better image quality. What I'm showing here, and you can see it's, I'm zoomed in a little bit, which is why I pointed to that on this. So I'm zoomed in twice to get even higher definition or to look at my target information closely over here on down imaging. But with traditional 2D, you can see I have a fairly hard bottom. I have this hump, little depression, and then all this right here, all right, could leave you scratching your head a little bit. And then again, very hard bottom that dips down again, and that follows the same bottom contour over here on down imaging. Well, just through experience and spending a lot of hours out on the water utilizing all this technology, I would know with pretty good certainty that that's a group of bait fish. Notice here too, I'm using medium chirp for frequency, all right? And instead of just a single frequency like 83 kilohertz or 200 kilohertz, medium or chirp operates on a range of frequencies. So therefore, because it's a range of frequencies, again, chirp is a technology that will give you that better target separation as well. So if you have a chirp capable transducer and a chirp capable unit, it's a good idea to run chirp even over 83 or 200 kilohertz to give you that better target separation. You can actually see it, these little white spots in this group of bait fish. But this clearly tells me, by contrasting the two side by side, that that's a group of bait fish. You can see a lot of separation between the individual white dots there. And those aren't big bait fish. I mean, there's a lot of smelt out on Quabbin. There's a lot of very small yellow perch that will school up. And I'm guessing that some of that could be, or most of it's probably a large school of smelt. Because I've caught smallmouth and they hack it up quite often. Again, with fish reveal, right here on the top of this hump, you can see, a nice arch that you don't pick up over here, even using medium chirp that you do here. And I can pretty much guarantee you there's some other fish arches here, here, and here. It actually looks like there's one going right into the bait school here that we don't see. So again, looking at that, you might think that, but looking over here, you can see that if there really was a fish there, that fish reveal would show you that fish. But typically when you come across a school of bait fish like that on Quabbin, it's money, right? You're going to be into the fish in a short amount of time. Slide points on that. Again, they're there for your review later on if you want to check this out on my YouTube channel. I just went over all of that. So for the sake of saving time and moving along, I'm going to talk about the next slide and then some more images. So again, this particular slide is still talking about the slide that I contrasted between 2D sonar and down imaging. All right. Zoom. On some of our units, you can use the multi-touch feature like you do on your cell phone. On others, that feature is not available, but the zoom buttons certainly are. So it's a good idea when you see targets out there on the water that you utilize that zoom feature to make your decision that much clearer as to what that target is or that sonar return is. All right, next slide. We're going way back in time here for you a little bit. Again, I told you I would contrast older side imaging technology with newer side imaging technology, and I did this purposely so that you can see how much better it's gotten over time. This is an older LSS2 transducer that I ran way back in 2015. All right. On another slide, you'll see that I actually have the date right there. But the same thing was true back then. Your transducers here, you're looking out to the right, you're looking out to the left. But what I wanted to point out here is even with that older technology, I could clearly see the stumps that were on this bottom, that there was a harder signal return right here, a stronger signal return because the bottom was harder, I should say. And then it starts to fade a little bit right here, either due to power or, I'm running 800 kilohertz. So like I said, we're putting less power into the water. We get less distance, right, with that, but we get better definition. So I could clearly see these stumps right here, but look at this smallmouth bed right there. And I know it's a smallmouth bed because it's an area where I catch smallmouth all the time, and I know that's one of the flats that they bed on. So you can clearly see, a clear ring and even, some shadows behind it of higher points on that. So you can use your side imaging as a tool, which it is, to go right along the shoreline and, clearly mark beds as well. I know it's a controversial subject, whether you should catch fish off of beds or not, but that's not the topic of this webinar. But you can certainly pick them out. And with the newer active imaging 3-in-1 transducers, or prior to that, the structure scan 3D transducer, that bed right there would be even, it would be significantly better as far as the quality of the image. And I couldn't find it, but I had another screenshot where I had probably 50 beds all in a row that were bluegill beds, and I could actually see the individual white return on, or two in some cases, where there was a male and female right on top of it. I could actually see the fish. All right, slide points. Again, frequency setting on that last one was 800 kilohertz. Remember, that's going to give you more definition, more detail, but less range than if you were to switch over to 455 kilohertz. All right, and I pointed out the fish bed in an area with stumps and hard bottom with little to no vegetation, bright returns, and then I pointed out where it actually got a little bit softer. Now, looking at this image, right, older LSS2 transducer, again, pretty good definition, but contrast that now. This is a screenshot I took with the newest active imaging 3-in-1 transducer that I have on my boat while I was fishing for crappie. So it's a highly powerful tool when you're looking for that fish holding cover, and in particular when you're looking for fish. This particular screenshot was taken last fall. You can see the water temperature wasn't even 45. My depth at the time was almost 23 feet. I don't have the range that well, actually I do. I had it set to 50. So again, not quite 3 times, but somewhere between 2 and 3 times the depth. Now, that particular day I was looking for crappie, and you can clearly see all these individual, all right, bright dots right here, and even over here towards the deeper water. There was a huge school of crappie. All right, I probably caught 200 that day, kept 20 for my wife Terry and I to eat later, and released all the rest. But you, if those were smallmouth, bigger than crappie, if they were largemouth or any other type of fish that was bigger, these white dots would just be a lot bigger than what you're seeing right here. So another question I get is, well, how come this side is so much brighter than this side? It's a very important question. Um, the water started to drop off deeper over to the right of me. So therefore, as I mentioned before, that sonar signal can't really just shoot out and then take a downward turn once it's already on, it comes down on an angle from here to here, which is the water column, and then out to, the side with that wider cone angle that I showed you before, and that's how you get the bottom coverage as well. But in deeper water, the image will also be darker. And to prove that, what I did next is I turned around to show you the same area, only coming in the opposite direction. Again, look at all the crappie, right? This time, because I turned the boat around, it's brighter on this side than it was on the other side. Makes sense? So the only other technical thing to think about if you're questioning, the stronger versus brighter return on your side imaging transducer, if it's not mounted correctly, let's say it's on an angle, all right, you can get this type of distinction between dark and light as well. So it's critical that when your transducer is mounted, you follow the guidelines in the installation manual to make that as level as you can across that horizontal plane. All right, you don't want it off kilter at all. All right, you want that transducer level. Said we'd talk about wood and different types of cover. So we've covered rock, we've covered hard bottom, we've covered weeds. This particular screenshot clearly shows, all right, a submerged tree. There's no guesswork involved there. You can tell just by looking at that's a submerged tree. And you look at these white dots up here, there's probably some fish that are off of it. I have another screenshot that's coming up next, again with my older LSS2 transducer, where you can actually pick off some fish that are right in the tree. And again, this is in 2015, dates right there. And clearly you can see that tree. The reason I included it in the webinar was, again, to show you that distinction between the distance between the bright white returns, the tree, right, and its sonar shadow, which you can see all right here. The further the distance between this sonar shadow and the stronger return, the higher that object is in the water column, and you can actually see that. All right. Sometimes if the fish are big enough, you got a suspended fish right here in the water column, you'll get its sonar shadow clearly shown over here, all right, to the right. Or if it was over here, the sonar shadow would be over here on the left-hand side. Again, I pretty much drove right over that tree. I was trying to get a screenshot of the right, so you can see that it's on both sides a little bit. But if you were to even zoom in more and look at this area right here, which you can do later if you review this on YouTube, pause it and stop here, there's like one fish there, and one fish there, right down in that tree. If the branch is solid, like this main branch right here, it's going to run that solid line. But I zoomed in at this particular time, and I could see that there was clearly 3 fish just up off the bottom, but close to that tree. Frequency, notice, is 455 kilohertz. So I'm putting a lot more power into the water right now by being on the 455 kilohertz range. So both sides in this particular case are that much brighter. And I could have done the same thing here. I was on 800 kilohertz. If I went to 455 kilohertz, you would have seen where this being real bright over here, it would brighten up this side as well. All right. It's not an error with your transducer. So keep that in mind when you're out there. All right. Some of you that are following along tonight in this webinar may know I actually was out on Webster Lake. There's a point. You can see where I came, out of slightly deeper water, but this point is clearly defined right here. And then that tree came down from the shoreline and landed in the water. And it typically holds fish at certain times a year. And I sure would like to be able to get down there with my snorkel or some diving. There's probably 100 jigs, crankbaits, jerk baits, because I've seen other people fishing it as well. So people that are listening probably know right where it's at. Okay, so what have we learned so far? The remainder of the slides basically are just some review. We're going on just a little over an hour, so I want to zip through these as fast as we can and leave some time for questions. So what have we learned? Let's review some screenshots. All right, we talked about dark versus bright objects. Again, I'm coming over the top, or this particular screenshot is not one I took, but they're coming over, they're coming through a shallow area, all right, or came over it, I should say, and dropped into deeper water. But notice it's a point. So the top of that point, all right, is much brighter. There's rock, a lot of rock. See the sonar shadow from this bigger rock right here? Looks like some trees or tree branches laying on the bottom here with their sonar shadows, and a little bit of weeds growing up the top. And again, notice all those white dots right here that we saw in previous slides. That point actually has some of that similar weed growth right on top of it, but then we drop off into a deeper, perhaps much softer bottom, as shown by this darker sonar return than up here. All right. Very close to the same type of thing, came up over a point. We can see this hard bottom area. It sticks right out like, a sore thumb, much brighter versus the softer, dark bottom. And again, those weeds that I just mentioned, all right, you see all this weeds along here comes up off just a little bit up off the top of that hump. And then again, notice the sonar shadow behind those tall weeds. Different angle of that same area, right? All those large rocks, brighter bottom, another one here, a little bit of difference in the bottom composition here, and again, that weed bed. And here you can see the weeds coming up off the bottom a little bit more there. All right, man-made objects we haven't talked a lot about so far, but docks don't always look like what you might expect. And this is an example of a dock. And again, what I would tell you to focus on is the sonar shadow. So all the columns, if you will, for the dock platform are these white dots, and they're casting those sonar shadows going all the way back to the shore. In some cases, I had a screenshot I didn't include, and I should have. It was down in Oklahoma. If the dock, they're rather large down there. They have lots of boats, and they're big boats. If the support columns are made out of metal, I mean, you'll see them clear as day when you're using side imaging. I mean, I could see them, they were perfect, cross members made out of metal, and you could see them perfectly. All right. So it's not always going to look exactly like you might expect, but I'm sure that when this was taken, the person that was in the boat could clearly see that there were docks there. And here you can see those sections of the dock. And again, these white dots would be some columns that would support it. The other types of things we've talked about already are the weeds. And in this particular case, right, there's an inside turn in that weed bed. So it comes along here. We got this void, this area that's void of weeds, and then they pick up again. And we all know that those are areas that fish like to hang out and live in as well. So, pay particular attention, as I said, to those darker versus brighter areas. And that's what you're looking at there. Of course, we all want to see fish. And if you think about everything that we've talked about here, now notice this big school of fish right here, that they're close to the bottom. They're not giving off, these great big sonar shadows. So they're probably smaller fish very tight to the bottom. And again, if you spend enough time out on the water and you start really diving into interpretation of these side and down imaging sonar returns, you would know that that's probably, again, I would bet money on it that it's probably either some perch all clumped up together, very close to the bottom, over a softer bottom, notice, all right, then the harder bottom could also be a bunch of bluegill. Um, but smallmouth don't typically group up in that big a school. I wish they did at times, and largemouth don't either, all right, but panfish certainly do. Okay, so I pointed out the difference in the transducers, and I won't go into the real heavy duty technical details of the transducer itself, because even as pro staff, we're not provided with that information. But in digging on the internet, I have found out that the difference really with the active imaging technology that gives us these much higher resolution returns is in the design of the transducer. All right, the much better elements, the way they're positioned, and then of course the high processing power of the newer units. You know, especially the HDS Lives, the 12s and the 16s have a quad core processor. If you're used to, you know, some of the older units, and then you sit down in front of one of those, you really fly around. The pages and all that information from the transducer is processed much faster and much more definition. All right. Some more active imaging screenshots where, again, you can really start to see at 800 kilohertz this greatly enhanced image definition. You can really see all that individual brush, the school of fish that are situated close by to it, here and here. Next slide is, again, a bunch of brush. You see this school of fish right here, and another school of fish tucked right into that brush. And as a crappie fisherman, that gets me excited because I love to fish for bass, as everyone knows. I love to catch smallmouth. I love to catch largemouth. But particularly this type of year and in the fall, I love seeing images like that and like that. This is just another one to show you, you know, the higher definition of the active imaging transducer and a bunch of tires that were littered on the bottom. Again, you can see this is a bigger tire casting a bigger sonar shadow, and it looks like there's actually, some of these might just be rims, and this rim is probably standing on its side and casting a sonar shadow that looks just like that donut. All right, again, another active imaging screenshot. You can see again a channel, probably an old river channel with brush all grown up in there. And again, if you focus in on it and you zoom in on it, those white dots right within all that brush are fish. And now I'll leave it open. I got to jump to my other screen here, and I'll take some questions if folks have them. All right, so if you see the chat room over there and you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll wait for a few minutes, and then if nobody has any questions, I'll end the webinar. And you can always get hold of me via email at wymanda46@comcast.net. You can look me up on Facebook or my Instagram page, which is DMW Fishing on Instagram. And any other way that I can help folks, I like to do so. All right. I'll give it a few more minutes, and then I'll end the live webinar stream here. And I hope somebody that logged in learned a thing or two from this video. And if you didn't have the opportunity to log in tonight, you can always go up to my YouTube channel. You can just Google Dale Wyman and Lowrance, and you'll see all the videos that I have uploaded. All right. All right. So surprisingly, I didn't have any questions. Thanks for tuning in, and everybody stay safe and healthy. Good night.